Venture into the quiet depths of the wilderness, but be warned, some silences are not empty, and some shadows stretch beyond the reach of light. These are not mere campfire tales. They're chilling accounts from ordinary individuals whose peaceful walks in the woods twisted into harrowing journeys of terror, leaving them forever marked by what they found when they believed they were utterly alone. The year was 2017, and Clara, a seasoned botanist, found her sanctuary deep within the ancient forests of Northern California. Her work often took her far off the beaten path, tracking rare flora and documenting ecological shifts. She was methodical, precise, and utterly at ease in nature's embrace. Her backpack was always meticulously packed with scientific instruments, a satellite phone, and enough supplies for extended stays. Clara believed in science, in logic, and in the predictable rhythm of the natural world. This belief was about to be shattered on a research trip into a particularly dense, old-growth section of the Redwood National Park, an area known for its towering, silent giants. It was late spring, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and redwood needles. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in an ethereal, perpetual twilight. Clara had hiked for hours, her boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves, her only companions the chirping of unseen birds and the distant rush of a creek. She was tracking a unique moss species, found only in specific microclimates, requiring her to venture deeper than usual, far beyond any marked trails. Her GPS indicated she was miles from the nearest road, a feeling she usually cherished, complete solitude. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange, Clara decided to make camp. She found a small, flat clearing nestled between several colossal redwoods, their ancient trunks reaching like gnarled fingers into the sky. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves high above. As she set up her small tent, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears. It was like a breath, a long, drawn-out sigh carried on the non-existent breeze. She paused, listening intently. Nothing. She dismissed it as the wind playing tricks in the towering pines. She cooked a simple meal, the small hissing of her portable stove sounding unusually loud in the overwhelming quiet. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, the silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive. The only light came from her headlamp and the faint glow of the stars filtering through the canopy. That's when the whispers started. At first, she thought it was the rustling of leaves or the creaking of tree branches. But then the sounds became distinct, undulating patterns, almost like a language she couldn't quite grasp. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a swirling chorus of hushed voices, too soft to decipher, too pervasive to ignore. Clara, a scientist to her core, tried to rationalize it. Infrasound? Wind currents interacting with the massive trees? But the whispers felt too deliberate, too close. She pulled out her sound recorder, a high-sensitivity device she used for capturing ambient forest sounds. She pressed record, holding her breath, trying to capture the elusive murmur. For a full minute, there was only silence on the playback. Then, as she was about to give up, a chillingly clear phrase emerged from the static. "She is not alone." The voice was raspy, ancient, and seemed to vibrate from within the very fabric of the forest. Clara's heart leapt into her throat. She fumbled with the recorder, dropping it. Panic began to coil in her stomach. She scrambled into her tent, zipping it shut, desperately trying to convince herself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind in the isolation. But the whispers intensified, pressing in on the tent, surrounding her. They grew louder, though still indistinct, an angry, murmuring multitude. She swore she could feel the faint vibration of the air as they swirled outside. She clutched her satellite phone, but her hands were shaking too much to dial. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the cacophony, a slow, deliberate dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor, circling her campsite. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. It was too large to be an animal, too rhythmical to be natural. The whispers seemed to crescendo with each dragging sound, taking on a more menacing tone. Then, silence. An absolute, terrifying silence that was worse than the whispers. After what felt like an eternity, Clara dared to peek out of her tent. Her headlamp beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the ancient trees. Nothing, just the vast, empty forest. She cautiously unzipped her tent and stepped out, her flashlight beam sweeping across the ground. That's when she saw it. Circling her tent, etched deep into the damp earth, was a perfect, unbroken ring, as if something immense had been dragged around her campsite. And within the ring, directly in front of her tent flap, were 3 small, crudely carved wooden effigies, similar to those she'd seen depicting protective spirits in indigenous art. But these were twisted, malformed, their blank faces turned towards her. They hadn't been there when she set up camp. Clara didn't hesitate. She abandoned her tent, her equipment, everything. She ran. She ran through the pitch-black forest, guided only by the distant glow of her headlamp, twigs snapping under her feet. The image of those effigies burned into her mind. She ran until she collapsed from exhaustion, gasping for breath, miles away from her campsite. When dawn finally broke, painting the forest in a deceptive golden light, she found a Forest Service road and flagged down a passing vehicle. She never returned for her equipment. Clara still works as a botanist, but she no longer ventures into truly remote areas alone. She often finds herself looking over her shoulder, convinced she can still hear the faint, echoing whispers of the pines, a reminder that some parts of the wilderness are not meant to be explored, and some silences are far from empty. Mark, a seasoned hunter and trapper, knew the Ozark Mountains like the back of his hand. He'd spent his life navigating its valleys and ridges, fluent in the language of its forests. For him, the woods were a place of peace, a provider, a second home. He prided himself on his self-reliance, his ability to read the signs, to survive on instinct alone. In October of 2019, he set out for a multi-day hunting trip, deep into a lesser-known section of the mountains, seeking the elusive white-tailed deer that frequented the area during the rut. He carried only what was essential: his rifle, a small hunting knife, a basic survival kit, and a week's worth of rations. His only communication with the outside world was an old two-way radio, used primarily for emergency contact with his hunting buddy, Jim, who was working a different section of the forest. The weather was crisp, with a clear, full hunter's moon, casting long, stark shadows through the bare trees. The air hummed with the promise of autumn. On his 3rd day, deep in the thickest part of the woods, Mark found fresh tracks. Large, clear deer prints leading towards a steep, rocky ravine. This was ideal hunting ground. He followed the trail for hours, the light fading as he pushed deeper. As night fell, he realized he'd gone further than planned. He decided to make a temporary camp in a small, sheltered alcove beneath an overhang, planning to continue the hunt at first light. He built a small, smokeless fire, cooked some dried meat, and settled down, his rifle within easy reach. The silence was absolute, save for the crackling of his fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Around midnight, a sound cut through the stillness. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thud, like something striking a tree. Thump, thump, thump. It was too slow for an animal, too deliberate for falling branches. Mark, ever cautious, extinguished his fire and listened. The sound seemed to be moving, drawing closer, still rhythmic, still unsettling. It had a hollow, woody quality to it, like a heavy stick hitting a resonant trunk. Then a new sound joined the thudding, a low, guttural humming. It was an ancient, wordless sound rising and falling in an unnerving pattern. It wasn't a human hum. It was too deep, too resonant, carrying an almost predatory quality. Mark felt a prickle of unease. He gripped his rifle, peering into the moonlit woods. The thudding and humming grew louder, closer, seeming to circle his camp. He tried his two-way radio. "Jim, you copy? Anything out there?" Only static. He tried again, frantically calling out. Nothing. The radio was dead. The thudding stopped abruptly, and the humming faded into a low, continuous drone that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Mark heard a rustling directly behind his lean-to, impossibly close. He spun around, rifle raised. There, silhouetted against the moonlight, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly slender, its limbs too long, too spindly. It seemed to be made of shadows, indistinct, yet its presence was overwhelming. It stood absolutely still, blending almost perfectly with the tree trunks. But Mark knew it wasn't a tree. He couldn't make out a face, only the impression of a head tilted slightly, as if listening. And then he heard it again, not from the figure, but from within the woods, surrounding him, the low, guttural humming. A chorus of voices now, deeper, more resonant, vibrating through his bones. He fired a warning shot into the air, the roar of the rifle echoing violently through the night. The figure didn't move, the humming didn't stop. Mark, a man who had never known true fear in the woods, felt an icy dread crawl up his spine. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't human. He turned and ran, scrambling over rocks and roots, the humming pursuing him like an invisible wave. He could hear the distinct sound of twigs snapping behind him, but there was no discernible pattern, no footsteps, just the persistent, unhurried breaking of branches. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out. He stumbled into a small cave deep enough to hide and huddled inside, shaking uncontrollably, his rifle clutched tight. The humming slowly faded, replaced by the profound, terrifying silence of the forest. He stayed there until dawn, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe loudly. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the cave entrance, he crawled out, exhausted and disoriented. He found his way back to his truck, driven by a primal need to escape the woods. He never looked back. Mark still hunts, but never alone, and never ventures into the deep, untouched parts of the Ozarks. He now carries a satellite phone and always ensures he has a clear line to Jim. He tells his story only to a select few, his voice hushed when he describes the shadow figure and the humming. And sometimes, late at night, when the moon is full, he swears he can hear a faint, distant thump echoing from the darkness beyond his window. In the summer of 2021, Liam, a passionate trail runner and ultramarathoner, sought solace and challenge in the vast interconnected trail systems of the Pacific Northwest. He was meticulous about his training, pushing his physical and mental limits, often spending entire days traversing remote, rugged terrain. He carried minimal gear, a hydration pack, a light jacket, and a GPS watch, relying on his speed and endurance to navigate. Liam reveled in the solitude of the long runs, the rhythmic pounding of his feet against the earth, the feeling of being one with the wild. One particularly ambitious run took him deep into a section of the Olympic National Forest, known for its dense, ancient rainforests and notoriously disorienting fog. The day started clear, but by midday, a thick, swirling mist began to roll in, enveloping the towering cedars and firs in a shroud of gray. Liam, confident in his navigation skills, pressed on, enjoying the eerie beauty of the mist-laden woods. The only sound was his own breathing and the soft, squishy thud of his running shoes on the mossy trail. As the fog thickened, visibility dropped to mere feet. His GPS watch, usually a reliable guide, began to glitch, its screen flickering erratically before freezing on a blank map. Liam wasn't overly concerned. He knew this trail well. He slowed his pace, relying on the subtle inclines and turns to orient himself. But then, something felt wrong. The trail, which had been relatively well defined, began to narrow, becoming overgrown. The trees pressed in closer, their branches dripping with moisture, creating an almost claustrophobic tunnel. Then he heard it, a whisper, just at the edge of his hearing. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the rustling of leaves. It was a distinct, low murmur, like a group of people talking just out of sight. Liam stopped, listening intently. The whispers seemed to come from deeper in the fog, ahead of him on the trail. He called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" The whispers ceased immediately, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. He continued cautiously, his unease growing. A few minutes later, the whispers returned, closer this time, seeming to surround him. They sounded like many voices, too many, and they seemed to follow his movements. He sped up, trying to outrun the disembodied sounds, but they kept pace with him, an unsettling, formless presence just beyond the veil of the fog. He could hear faint, almost imperceptible rustles in the undergrowth beside the trail, as if unseen bodies were moving just out of sight. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into a single chilling sound, a child's high-pitched giggle, echoing clearly through the dense fog, seemingly right behind him. Liam froze, his blood running cold. There were no children out here, miles from any road or town. He spun around, but the fog was a solid wall, revealing nothing. The giggle repeated, closer this time, and then others joined in, a chorus of childish, mocking laughter swirling around him, coming from all directions. He broke into a desperate sprint, blindly following the increasingly faint trail. The laughter pursued him, seemingly effortlessly, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes right beside him. He could feel an unnatural chill, a dampness that was colder than the fog itself, pressing against his skin. The air began to carry a faint, cloying, sweet scent, like something sickly floral mixed with damp earth. He tripped, falling hard onto the mossy ground. As he pushed himself up, his hand landed on something cold and hard. He looked down. It was a small porcelain doll's head, its eyes painted wide and staring, lying half buried in the moss. He recoiled, scrambling backward. The laughter intensified, a swirling vortex of sound. And then he saw them. Through the shifting curtain of fog, indistinct shapes began to appear between the trees. They were small, childlike figures, their forms blurred and wavering in the mist. They seemed to float just above the ground, their limbs appearing too long, too spindly. He couldn't make out faces, only the impression of hollow eyes and wide, unsettling smiles. They weren't running, they were gliding, slowly emerging from the fog, forming a loose semicircle around him. The laughter was now a continuous, high-pitched peal that scraped at his sanity. Liam, a man who thrived on control and physical endurance, felt a primal, suffocating terror. He didn't think, he reacted. He found a sudden burst of adrenaline and ran, veering off the trail, crashing through the undergrowth, ignoring the scraping branches and the sharp thorns. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest. The laughter followed him, then, slowly, agonizingly, began to fade. He burst out of the dense forest onto a small gravel logging road, gasping for air, collapsing onto the cold ground. The fog was still thick, but the laughter was gone. His GPS watch suddenly flickered back to life, displaying his location miles from where he thought he was, deep in an uncharted section of the forest. He eventually found his way back to his car, utterly spent, his mind reeling. Liam still runs, but never alone, and never in areas known for dense fog. He has since discovered an obscure online community of trail runners who share similar, unverified accounts of lost children in specific, remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, always accompanied by disembodied laughter and an unsettling sweet scent. He sometimes checks his running shoes for tiny bits of moss, convinced he'll find one of those dolls' heads caught in the treads. And sometimes, when he's alone in the quiet of his home, he swears he can hear a faint high-pitched giggle echoing from the corners of his mind, a chilling reminder of what lurks beyond the well-worn path.